So, before I give the floor to him for introducing today's speaker, just a couple of standard things about any Zoom meeting. So, please, I would ask the audience to keep your mics off throughout the meeting. And if you have any question, please raise your hand after the meeting, and then we will address your question. Then, if you're not okay with asking the question directly, you can ask it in the chat, and we will ask the question to the speaker on behalf of you. So, over to you, Tuhin.
Yeah. Uh, yeah. Welcome you all to the first CMB Bharat Cosmology seminar series. So I'm pleased to introduce Professor Ben Wandelt as our first seminar speaker from Institut d'Astrophysique de Paris, IAP. So Professor Ben is a well-known figure in the cosmology community, and he did his PhD in astrophysics from Imperial College, London. He held early career research fellowship in Neil Bohr's Institute in Copenhagen and at Princeton University. In 2001, he became assistant professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. In 2010, he was awarded International Chair of Theoretical Cosmology at Sorbonne University and Institut d'Astrophysique de Paris. So in 2011, he became a founding co-director of Institut Lagrange de Paris in cosmology, astroparticle, and theoretical physics, and was named director in 2014. So he held long-term visiting faculty positions at Max Planck Institute of Astrophysics, Caltech, Princeton University, and now in 2017 he joined the Center for Computational Astrophysics at the Flatiron Institute in New York City. So today he will talk about machine learning in cosmology, Whither the CMB. So over to you, Ben. Uh, yeah, you can start.
Thank you. Thank you for the very kind introduction. And let me just say that it's a great pleasure to give this talk. I wish I could be there. It could be in person, but sometimes, uh, the Earth is still pretty big, and so traveling and getting everyone in one place sometimes can be complicated. And we have these tools now, so I'm glad to see you here. All right, so let me get right into it. I probably don't really have to show this slide for this audience, but let me just, so we know what we're talking about, say that we're in cosmology, we now have a model for the entire universe, starting from an initial period and that made the universe large and long-lived and smooth, but with some perturbations. We have our most direct probe of that initial time is the cosmic microwave background at this point. And it's very detailed. And this is, of course, very exciting because we will learn more and more about this. But then this cosmic microwave background radiation travels through the universe and actually is a probe as a backlight of many other interesting bits of physics that we would like to learn about, the formation of galaxies, clusters of galaxies, and their gas content and the state of those objects. And then very recently, in the history of the universe, we have observed an accelerated expansion. Okay. But actually, this picture, as I'm showing it to you here, is it's a nice illustration, and it shows you some examples of what I'm talking about. But actually, I prefer the following picture, which is a bit more abstract, admittedly, but gives a very good view of what we actually observe when we look at the universe, because the previous picture can be a bit misleading about that. So let's just be completely clear here. So this is our past light cone visualized in terms of this traffic cone. And imagine that you're at the top here, and that event, our current space-time event, we call the here and now. And what we see when we look into the sky is everything on the surface of this past light cone. So all light rays that reach you right now reach you from this surface of your past light cone if you look out into the universe. That means the information, or most of the information that we have about the cosmos, really is coming from this surface. And if you can really think about this in detail and understand a lot about the reason why cosmology works, and also what the ultimate limits are of observational cosmology from pondering this diagram. And if you go back to early times, so at the bottom of this diagram here, you see a plane. So I've drawn in a equal time hypersurface. That time is the end of inflation, for example, or the end of whatever process created the early universe and made the universe large and long-lived and with perturbations, as I mentioned before. And if you think about evolution, really, like in terms of physical dynamics, everything that happens afterwards is really determined by the state on this equal time hypersurface. And in fact, it's not even all of that. It really everything that you can observe here is determined in terms of anything that is inside this light cone here, this kind of disk. If you can imagine this disk here at the bottom, I'll visualize that later. Okay, and all the world lines of all of those initial events go up on this diagram, and they intersect the diagram at various times in our cosmic past. And then if we look out into the universe and we receive massless messengers, so for example photons, then we see all of the consequences of these world lines intersecting our past light cone. That's really the causal structure of the universe and what we observe. Okay, and well, the words on this just give you a few milestones in our cosmological model, what happened, and here are all the different observations that trace, the structure here as we see it on our past light cone. Okay, so what we want to learn from all these observations, including the cosmic microwave background, I should have pointed out, let's say this is one circle on here. I've had to suppress a couple of dimensions when I drew this. So the circle, the sphere upon which we observe the cosmic microwave background, the surface of last scattering on this diagram is just this circle and that intersects this past light cone. Okay. So what we want to learn from this are facts about the cosmic beginning. We want to learn the cosmic content of the universe, and we also want to learn the dynamics of the universe, especially in its recent history, because we see that the universe is accelerating its expansion, and we want to probe that. And so there are a bunch of parameters here that parameterize all these different things, and I've labeled a few of them here in case you're not familiar with them. Okay, so the cosmic microwave backgrounds, therefore, is in some sense a way for us to look into the past. And in fact, as I just told you, as you know now, when we look into the universe, we look into the past. We see, in fact, all times between now and really almost the beginning of the universe, except that at some point at very early times, the universe is no longer transparent. So the bottom part of this past light cone we can't see directly because light doesn't actually travel on a straight line at that point. So, but in that way, looking at the cosmic microwave background is like using a time machine and looking back at the early universe. And you can use it to reconstruct going from the CMB here. You see, I hope you see my cursor, from the CMB observations all the way back to the base of this past light cone. We can use techniques that we developed in the early 2000s to actually get information about the initial conditions directly. And I'm showing you here an image that's very personal to me, because this is the first time that I saw this image. The image in the publication is more polished, but this is actually the very first time that I had used the temperature and polarization anisotropies measured in the Planck mission to make an image of the primordial perturbations as they would have emerged directly from at extremely early times in our universe's past. So this was from 2013. Again, if you look at the Planck publications, there are actually images in there from later data, but I thought I'd share with you this moment. And this is from temperature data, and if you include polarization data, the image becomes a lot more detailed, and that is because in this inverse problem of getting back to the initial conditions from observations a few 100,000 years after the Big Bang, the operators that connect these initial conditions with what we can observe have a different structure, and so the polarization data and the temperature data actually complement each other. And so these reconstructions are the basis for many results that were published, for example, in the context of the Planck mission, so the Planck constraints on inflation, and coming from both the two-point correlations, so from the power spectrum, the distribution of fluctuations in scale in these maps, and also these are direct inputs to the constraints on primordial non-Gaussianity, which have really sharpened our understanding of what the early universe looked like. Okay, and also other early universe paradigms were strongly constrained by these results. Okay, so going back to this, let's try to actually visualize what these initial conditions look like here at this disk here. I'm showing you this disk at the bottom of the past light cone, of our past light cone. And if I put back the dimensions I suppressed for that initial image, I get this. So this is a visualization really that this initial state that determines everything that happens in the universe afterwards through the physical equations, our physical model, that really is all that information is encapsulated in this ball. Okay, and what I'm showing here is a simulation of the initial perturbations with the correct statistical properties that we've learned from Planck. And this point here in the middle, so the world line that eventually leads to us, starts in the middle of this ball. So this is just an attempt to help you visualize what we want to learn about the universe. There are two aspects. One aspect is the initial conditions of the universe. We want to characterize those in terms of physics and in terms of their statistical properties. And then we also want to learn about the laws of physics that and all the processes that translate this initial condition into what we can observe on our past light cone. And so in the most detailed way of doing that, and almost, so in these days, that's really the most advanced way of doing that, is using computational methods. So we start with initial conditions, we specify the cosmological parameters, and then use physics, gravity, gas physics, and everything we know about all of the dynamics of the universe, galaxy formation, evolution, the way that black holes interact with structure formation, star formation processes, even within galaxies that have an effect on how galaxies appear and how they eject material, and plasma physics in terms of these large clusters of galaxies, for example. And that gives rise to all the observations that we use to probe the cosmos, of which I'm just showing you a few here. And in fact, I'm already showing you here these are some galaxy observations, but here are some CMB observations. And actually, this is a visualization of the polarization data that we see in the cosmic microwave background. And one thing you notice is that it doesn't look as nice and Gaussian as the map that I showed you earlier. And that's because really, in this day and age, we are always dealing with non-Gaussian, nonlinear problems in cosmology. And what we're looking at here are foregrounds from very complicated processes of dust emission from our local galaxy that give you polarization that we have to somehow deal with when we want to peer through that and get information about all of the bits here on the left part of this diagram. So in CMB data analysis, this leads to this what I just discussed leads to a certain number of challenges. And here my 3 points: systematics, systematics, and systematics. So, and what do I mean by that? Systematics means parts of the data that are hard to model and that are not necessarily maybe the things that you initially thought you were interested in, but that could actually turn out to be very interesting in their own right. So instrumental and observational systematics, these are very important. And anyone who actually does data analysis will tell you that this is you have to pay a lot of attention to those. That's not typically why we do the analysis. It's important to know about your instrument, but that's not really the end goal. But the other part is non-Gaussian anisotropies. So, for example, the Sunyaev-Sedovich effect in its various forms, thermal, kinetic, all of the imprints that are left on the cosmic microwave background from all of the structure in between us and the surface of last scattering, for example, lensing of the CMB by the structure in between. Those are now primary science goals of doing CMB experiments, especially on the high resolution end of things. And foregrounds. So foregrounds for us are annoyances that we want to get rid of, nuisances. But for others are real science. They're interested in all the dust properties in our galaxy, and but they are unavoidably part of the data sets that we have and that we will use, and especially on the large scales where we look for primordial B modes, for example, which is one of the main drivers of the current explosion of CMB experiments. In terms of a lot of funding is going into building high resolution and large sky CMB experiments on various, both in space and on the ground. So a lot of that is driven by the desire to put constraints on primordial B modes, but unfortunately, just in that regime, foregrounds are very important. So we need to understand those. And I'll get back to that. So then discovery of those bits of physics that we're interested in is just about turning this arrow around from taking these observations that can be quite complicated and learning about the initial conditions, R, so which parameterizes the tensor to scalar ratio in inflation, which you get from the B modes, and all of the physics that lie in between here and connecting the two. Okay. So in this process, we have to deal with complex data sets, complicated data sets. And now we're going to really switch to exposing or giving you a flavor of a revolution that has occurred in this field over the last 6 years or so, including some papers that we've written in our group that showed how to do analysis for really complicated data sets, including the highly nonlinear data sets, where you only have, for example, computational models, or where the link between the data and your science can be quite nonlinear. So so as I said, over the last 5 or 6 years, this major shift has occurred, and I will now talk about how we can analyze data if all we can do is simulate it. So that's typically true when you have really non-Gaussian, nonlinear data sets. So in the CMB game, we are very familiar with simulations. Certainly in Planck and all the other experiments have large simulation efforts. And so these are used to characterize the signal, but also characterize the noise properties. And these simulations can be quite detailed, and the detail in these simulations is often very difficult to capture in terms of this likelihood function that we know and love and really care about in all kinds of data analysis problems. But writing down this likelihood function has become extremely complicated. I mean, I've spent quite a lot of time in my career writing down likelihoods for more and more complicated data models, including correlated noise in, where the properties of the noise change as a function of position in the sky. So this is with work with Dugesh Kodi Ramana, for example, and Guillaume Lavaux that I've done in the past. But I thought I was going to tell you about that, but in fact, I've now decided that I was going to tell you about this whole new set of analysis techniques that allow doing analysis without writing down these complicated likelihood models, but just writing down simulations that include the necessary complexity. So let me give you a simple example. And as I give you this example, this is going to be a very simple inference problem where we learn a parameter from some data. And as I do that, I want you to keep a running count of the number of times that we evaluate the likelihood and the prior. And in the process, actually, I explain all of Bayesian statistics to you too in the next few slides. So you're getting good value for your time here. So let me explain to you Bayesian inference. When we do inference, we have a parameter and we have some data. And in fact, I'm assuming that we have only one parameter here and only one data, but even for much more complicated problems with many parameters and many data points, the concepts remain really the same. Okay, so when I'm doing Bayesian inference, I need to specify a prior. So I need to say something about what I know about the parameters before I do an experiment. And so in this particular case, I'll just assume that this parameter I really don't know where it is between 0 and 1. I know it's between 0 and 1, but I have no preference for any one value. So that means I can just generate uniformly between 0 and 1. Remember, I didn't actually evaluate the prior. I just generated samples from the prior. It's very different. Okay, so here are some samples of the parameter theta. And now for every theta, I'm going to generate data realizations. So these are going to be, let's say for point 2, I run my simulation forward, I get a point for point, and I keep doing this for all the thetas that I've generated and some more that I'm not showing you here. So here's a cloud of points that I've now generated. So these are drawn from this likelihood that I said before. Okay, this is the probability distribution for the data given the parameters. So these are these vertical slices in this diagram. Okay, and actually now having done that, this point cloud is a sample from the joint distribution of the parameter and the data. Okay, because I've drawn the parameter from its marginal distribution from the prior, and then for every one of those, I've drawn a realization of the data given a particular value of the parameter. Okay, so that gives me this joint distribution. All right. So what does Bayesian inference mean? Well, for Bayesian inference, I have one data set, whatever the data are that I collected. So that's going to be a line on this diagram. So here's an example. So for this example, I actually generated a data point here. And so now I'll just look at which possible parameters could have given rise to this data set. Okay, so all I have to do then is just to see where this line intersects this cloud, and then look and then draw a PDF, a probability density function of the density of these points along this line. Now, to make this work in this particular example, I have to make the line slightly thick, okay, so that I just actually capture a few points. But that's an implementational detail that if actually later on, I'm just going to completely, this is not the method that I actually use later on. But just to be completely honest, to collect these points, I have to make the line, I have to give the line a finite thickness. And then I'll collect all the points that this thick line lies on top of. And then I just make a histogram of those. Okay, here we are. So this is now the distribution P of theta given D. So this is basically given this data point, I slice through here, and that gives me the conditional density for theta given that I'm on this line. All right, and that is the posterior distribution. So in fact, that tells us what I now know about theta given that I've observed D. All right, the true theta that I used to generate this data point was a half. Okay, so actually this posterior distribution nicely contains the truth. but in real situations we don't know this. But for this situation, that's what I use to generate my data point. Okay, so this is exactly the same distribution as on the previous slide, but now blown up. So here's the end result of my inference. I now know my posterior distribution given the data that I have. And now ask yourselves, how many likelihood evaluations did I have to do to get this? None, right? Because all I had to do is just simulate data. I never had to actually evaluate any likelihood. I just had to run some code, for example, to generate these data points. How many times did I have to evaluate the prior? None, right? We discussed this in the beginning. All I had to do was just generate possible initial parameter points using any method that I like, any simulation method that I want. And so the prior is implicitly encoded in the way I generate the initial thetas, and the likelihood is implicitly encoded in the way that I generate data points given initial parameters. And therefore, this is called implicit inference. So this is a way to do Bayesian analysis where the likelihood and or the prior are not explicitly specified, but implicit in the way that parameters and data are generated. And so this could be in the form of simulations, it often is in cosmology, but it could also be in terms of any other generative models, so not real physics simulations, but you could maybe run a neural network to generate some data, or even if you, in some cases, observed data themselves can be useful. If you happen to have labeled data, so data points that are labeled with parameters, you can actually use real data to inform this. And different names for this are called likelihood-free inference, which is a bit of a misnomer because, there's still a likelihood. It's just that you don't write it down explicitly, but it's encoded in the simulations. Sometimes it's called simulation-based inference. That's often appropriate, but does it have to be real physics simulations? So simulation-based inference is a bit more specific. Or in the old days, this was called approximate Bayesian computation because of this epsilon. When you do it in the way that I actually showed you for this example, then there's this epsilon, and the bigger I make the epsilon, the more approximate this inference technique becomes. But we won't have any epsilon in many of the cases that I'll show you later. And so to really make this feasible, though, we can't unfortunately do this the way that I showed you. That works well in low numbers of dimensions. So when you have one parameter, one data point, but in high numbers of dimensions, this becomes hard to do just because the volume gets very large, and basically you never find points that intersect your data in your simulations if you do it this ABC way. But we can use machine learning to take us the rest of the way. Once you realize that it's possible, and you have this image, this picture in your head in this plane, parameters versus data, it turns out that you can just simply recast any inference problem that you may have as an optimization problem, write down a neural network to solve this optimization problem, and then use the techniques that we've now learned that optimization problems neural networks are really good at solving optimization problems, and we just exploit that to get these solutions. So here's a very, very simple example. Okay, so you're getting a little bit short statistics lesson. We're going to get back to cosmology in just a minute. So in this example, we train a machine learning model. It can be f of x. So f is some kind of machine learning model. Could be a neural network that takes an input x and is supposed to predict an output y based on x, okay? And this is, for example, when you do polynomial fitting, this is exactly the sort of loss function that you minimize. So then f is a polynomial, but f could be a neural network or any other functional form. And so you're all familiar with how to do this for polynomials, for example. You just as a least square problem, you write some linear equation, you solve it, and you're done. But let's think about what this actually means, because this sum here is over pairs of x and y, okay, of data, let's say data and parameters. So if you want to predict your parameters from your data, then x will be data, y will be parameters. And you have data parameter pairs, and you want to get the prediction to be least squared, and so you sum over these data parameter pairs. Okay, so what is this? If you take the continuum limit, if you have many, many, many samples, then this really, you can think of this as a Monte Carlo approximation to this integral. So you have this squared loss here, but then x and y pairs are drawn from this joint distribution of x and y. And this is exactly the joint distribution I showed you in the earlier slide. So x is data, y is parameters. And then it turns out you can actually easily minimize, find which function minimizes this integral just using elementary variational calculus. And it turns out the function that minimizes this is this function. And this is very interesting because you see the probability distribution here is a conditional probability distribution. And remember, y were the parameters we're trying to guess, and x were the data. So this is the posterior distribution, parameters given data. And this integral is actually the expectation of y, of the parameters, under the posterior distribution. Or in other words, the posterior mean. Okay, so it turns out you only have to solve a least squared problem to get the posterior mean. This is kind of surprising because if you've ever done any data analysis in cosmology, Bayesian in a Bayesian way, you typically have to write down your likelihood, you have to write down your prior, you get your data, then you run a Markov chain to get to get lots and lots of samples of this posterior distribution. Then you take averages to get the posterior mean. So it's quite a complicated process. And here it seems like you can just do this just by solving a least squared optimization problem. So this really is a powerful insight, and that's what led us to in 2011. I was 21. This is the archive number is wrong. This was in 2019, which was presented at a Europe's workshop in 2020. Basically, we used neural networks to represent these functions, and then to train a neural network to just directly compute the posterior mean given a data set. So now, once the network is trained, you give it a data set, it immediately returns to you the posterior mean. No Markov chains, nothing, no complicated, and it's only trained on simulations. And if you also want to know how wide the posterior is, you can write down a different loss, very similar ideas, to get the variance of the posterior given the data. Okay, so this is we call these moment networks because they give you the moments of the posterior. And it turns out if you actually want to get the posterior distributions, let's say for a single parameter or pairs of parameters, you can write down similar loss, a different kind of loss function. Then in that case, you have to have the neural network represent this posterior density for the, let's say, one parameter, two parameters here. And you can directly learn the marginal parameters. Again, no requirement to run Markov chains. You just learn, you have a neural network that given data set immediately returns to you the things that you would put in your corner plot in your paper. Okay, the two-dimensional marginals, for example, for the parameters. So this solves the curse of dimensionality that you have for large numbers of parameters, because instead of having to first run a very, very high dimensional Markov chain that takes a long time to converge and so forth, you directly get to the marginalized version immediately to get low dimensional posterior marginals directly as a function of the data. So this can be applied to very complicated situations. Here, this is one example where we take outputs of hydro simulations. And here, these are camels, hydro simulations. Camels simulations are a corpus of hydro simulations from various hydrodynamical models that are freely available. You can go and download them, play with them, and we take outputs of these hydro simulations and try to guess back the cosmological parameters, and in fact also the simulation parameters. And these are very complicated objects. So these are, these could be, well, there's dark matter density, but there's also gas density, gas temperature, metallicity of the gas, stellar mass, all kinds of outputs that can be quite nonlinear. And that, if you, like 5 years ago, if somebody had told you that we could fit hydro simulations, they would have looked at you and said, well, come on, that's way too hard. But actually now there are many papers that are doing this. This was one of the first. So this is again exactly these loss functions that I just talked about before for the variance, posterior variance, and posterior mean. And once you have the posterior mean, posterior variance, you can make these data points, And so for various true sets of parameters, you can then apply this to outputs of the hydro simulations and determine the parameters from there. Okay, and so here's this for omega matter, this is for sigma 8, so it works extremely well. Works also for the for these other parameters. Okay, but so gas temperature is already pretty interesting, but let's do metallicity just as another example, and it still works. So you can do these very complicated nonlinear inference problems using these techniques. This has been applied to 20 other completely other situations. So this is 21 centimeter light cones, so 3D data sets, and even to graphs. So in the context of galaxy surveys or clusters, surveys of clusters of galaxies, you could take each cluster or each galaxy as a node in a graph and then label these nodes with their properties and then connect them with edges where the distance information is encoded on the edges. And then it turns out you can actually get cosmological parameters out of these very general data representations. So this is work with Lucas McKinnon as a PhD student at Imperial that I'm co-advising. Okay, so if you are excited about this and you want to try this out, we just quite recently, last month, released a software package that we call, for various reasons, we call LTU-ILI. Okay, so the name could be better, but so this is called Learning the Universe, Implicit Likelihood Inference. And this is led by Matt Ho, who's currently a postdoc at IAP. And as part of this Learning the Universe collaboration, which is funded by the Simons Foundation. And so go to this archive number, download the code, play with it. It's really state of the art, and it's meant to be very, very easy to use. And if you have any difficulty running it, don't hesitate to contact either me or Matt. I'm happy to forward email. And it works for a broad range of data types, etc. Okay, and this is a lot of, and so in the paper you will see examples from various astrophysical inference problems, and so it's really quite general. Okay, so going beyond parameters, I focused on the initial conditions, and here's an example of doing initial condition reconstruction also using implicit inference methods. Go over this quite quickly because I want to talk about some other things later, but this is using a method called diffusion models. This is the same kind of technique that I'm sure you've seen these image generators like DAL-E and others, where you describe an image and it generates an image for you. So this is really very similar mathematics under the hood. These diffusion models are able to generate quite general images just from a bunch of examples. And the way that they do this is by using the fact that when you add noise to any image, if you add enough noise, eventually it just becomes pure noise. And then the brilliant insight was that if I just start with any noise realization, and if I am able to reverse this process, then I end up somewhere in image space, okay? And it's easy to generate any sort of noise. And then because any image ends up as noise, I can just start with noise and get back to any image, okay, that is in the space of examples. And so this works extremely well. On the way back, you have to this backward step. You're solving little inference problems where you just keep guessing what the previous image was given given the next. Okay, so you start with the noisy image, go to the slightly less noisy image, and so forth. And then as you do that, some image emerges, which depends on whatever the random numbers were in the initial set. So this is the paper that really made this work was Song et al. 2021, a very famous paper. Many others have come afterwards. And so we're doing this, and if you're doing generative modeling, if you're generating images based on, for example, a text prompt, so if you write, please generate an image of a cute dog looking at me, then it does this generation process not in an unconstrained way, like I just described, but also conditions on some additional information. So in that particular case, it conditions on the text, okay, basically a vector embedding of the text. So this is an example from nonlinear large-scale structure from a dark matter distribution. So we ran a bunch of n-body simulations. This is called the Quixote simulation set. This is Paco Villascusa Navarro, who ran those. They're freely available. You can also download and play with them. I'm sure many of you have seen them. But these are completely nonlinear n-body simulations with these parameters. And the idea is, can we use these diffusion models to generate pictures of the initial conditions that we use to generate the fully nonlinear final conditions? Okay, so now we're solving inverse problems. The grid size is 128 cubes, so that's millions of voxels, and so we're solving inverse problems in millions of voxels that are completely nonlinear. So here's an example of such an initial point that was generated. Here's another. Okay, so these are approximations to posterior samples, Bayesian posterior samples of the initial conditions given the final output of the n-body simulation. Okay. And this works really well. If you actually compare it to the true initial conditions, this is a slice. You see that the inferred initial conditions are really accurate. And because you have samples, you can then measure the fluctuations and see where are the uncertainties. And you can see here in the present day, there are these clusters, for example, here are these high density clumps. And you see that the uncertainty in the initial conditions is concentrated near these high density clumps. And that's very understandable because it makes a lot of sense, because if you think about what happens around high density clumps, all of the initial conditions, all the whole volume around that collapse into this high density clump and just become a clump. And so the information is lost about exactly what the configuration was inside this overdense initial region. And so the initial conditions, any kind of internal structure in these patches can lead to this outcome, and therefore the variance there is large when you look at these posterior samples. This is just showing the accuracy of the reconstruction in quantitatively. So these are the power spectra of the reconstructions, the truth and the inferred, very, very close. This is the ratio of the truth to the inferred. So you see down to the Nyquist frequency, we're talking about percent level accuracy. And this shows the cross correlation of the reconstructed initial conditions with the true. And you see that the cross correlation is much higher than what you would get from any linear filter. Okay, and this is so you could say, okay, fine. But, the smallest scale here this is like 8 megaparsecs. 8 megaparsecs is nonlinear, but not super nonlinear. So how far can you push this? Well, we pushed it pretty far. We now did one case that's not published yet, but we did a case using the camel simulations that I mentioned before, these hydro simulations. They're in much, much, much smaller boxes, very high resolution. So, basically one tiny little piece here of Quixote box gives you a 25 megaparsec box, which is for these camel simulations. So there are also n-body simulations. These are not the hydro ones. And it turns out, look, we can do the same problem, same thing there. The accuracy is very comparable. And so this is really pretty amazing. So it turns out these neural networks have understood gravitational dynamics completely. Like they can give you the initial conditions of a super nonlinear output, with some, roughly percent level accuracy, even on these tiny scales. So the smallest voxel here is of the scale of maybe a few hundred kiloparsecs. Okay, so sub-cluster scale. So this general methodology can be applied also very generally, and so I encourage you to look at this paper. Let's see, here's the reference, because the general approach is really works. This is the first time this was applied in cosmological context to an inverse problem, high dimensional inverse problem. So in the CMB context, I've done some work in the past solving this using explicit methods, writing down the explicit likelihood, doing the sampling, figuring out sampling techniques, Hamiltonian Monte Carlo techniques for generating delensed CMB skies. but that's limited, for example, by a Gaussian noise assumption, which may not be accurate when you're dealing with complicated foregrounds or secondary anisotropies, you know, SZ effect and so forth, the kinetic SZ effect that contaminates the CMB maps when you're doing lensing. And so this is ongoing work where people are trying to use these kinds of techniques, these machine learning techniques, to generalize these methods for delensing. And on the other hand, there are also explicit analogs, like explicit likelihood analogs with Markov chains, etc., trying to do this for galaxy surveys, which is something that we started in 2013, which is still very active. There's the Quilla consortium and many papers on this Borg technique. And so I think it's very good to have these two approaches so that you can cross-check one against the other. Because I mean, these machine learning techniques do require, I mean, they're much less mechanistic. They're harder to debug. If they don't work, you don't really know why. And there's a lot of, so they're extremely powerful, but also need to be checked in limits where we can check them. And so it's good to have both. Okay, so the cosmic background maps that we have extend over the whole sky. What I've shown you so far has been limited in terms of either 2D or 3D patches. So what can we do to do this, make this more general? And so work with Shaosheng Zhao from Tsinghua University, who's visiting me long-term at IAP, and Alex Cole. We've tried to build convolutional neural networks that can work on the sphere, on the entire sphere. And so, for example, in HEALPix, but also in other pixelizations, we call this Sphinx for spherical convolutional neural networks in JAX. That's the framework we're using to code this. So it runs on GPUs, for example. So the idea here is to use a technique that we developed years ago with my former student, Franz Elsner, called RCOS, which is a fast convolution technique, which we used for radial kernels. So kernels that look like this on the top right here, kernels that don't have angular structure, that just are a function of the radius from the center. And this works by doing FFTs on rings in a spherical pixelization. So doing kind of convolutions in one direction, and then you sum over the rings to get the final convolution sort of in the center of the map. But we can generalize this now to, first of all, run it on GPUs. Secondly, under JAX, and also do it for for kernels with arbitrary structures, so that we can do interesting problems related to nonlinear data sets on the sky. So this is in preparation, but should be coming out shortly. I mean, maybe on a month timescale. So look out for this. And we'll make code available to do this. So we are currently already using this on some public data sets for benchmarks, where people have used all kinds of other techniques, because there aren't any publicly available methods that actually can do these general convolutions. So this is a case of weather prediction. And this is actually a predicted map. This is the truth. And let's see how well this does. It turns out that, so against all these kinds of other techniques, our points down here are actually state of the art. So we are actually doing better than all these other techniques in terms of predicting the weather, or the climate quantities. These are temperature and geopotential maps. Using these techniques. So this is quite exciting. And I can't wait to apply this to cosmological problems, including the CMB. To make these methods, you always need training data. So Anirban Banerjee, who's a graduate student now at the Institute for Astrophysics in Paris with me, is looking at training these neural networks and then seeing how the constraints change as you increase the number of training simulations. And what we find is that there are scaling laws, and we also have ways to predict what the optimum will be. And so basically by looking at measuring scaling laws for small numbers of simulations and then extrapolating and then seeing when you hit the the optimum, we can predict the order of magnitude of number of simulations needed to get into the asymptotic regime. Okay, so in this particular case, we probably need something around 4,000 simulations. So this is work in preparation. So CMB simulations, in terms of the primary anisotropies are trivial. You just need to generate Gaussian random fields. So with HELPIX, where, I'm one of the authors of HELPIX, we wrote code to do that many, many years ago. But the current high resolution data sets need to include all these other physical effects. So lensing, we also have code for that, but then, for example, the effect due to Sunyaev-Sadovich scattering of the photons, the kinetic effect, the thermal effect, and all kinds of other secondary anisotropies, potential, nonlinear potential changes, etc., etc. So that will require, if you want to use machine learning techniques to analyze those kinds of data sets, you need hydrosimulations or some other models for generating lots and lots of data. We have some tools to reduce the number of simulations needed. There's recent work that's focused on actually also using neural networks to generate simulations that include these effects. But actually, I want to show you an example where we can learn from a single simulation in some cases. So here is something called wavelet moment synthesis or wavelet phase harmonics. So here the idea is to compute wavelet coefficients and then compute moments of these wavelet coefficients that are really good at characterizing the spatial statistics of a field, and then compute those on a single simulation. So this could even be data, if you have noiseless data. We're figuring out how to do it with noisy data as well, but certainly from a simulation, you can measure these coefficients, call them phi, and then train a neural network to generate fields that have these wavelet moments on average. So here are some examples, very relevant to CMB. This is polarized dust emission in the interstellar medium. This is a simulation that's very costly with radiative transport, magnetic field simulation with dust. Here's what you get. One simulation, we measure these coefficients, train neural networks to generate maps that have those coefficients on average. And so we can generate these syntheses. And so you can do this many, many times. Each one of those generations here, takes just milliseconds, whereas the simulation itself took many hours. We can apply it to other kinds of fields. This is a slice of an n-body simulation. Here's a target. That's one simulation that we use to train this. And here's the synthesis. So it just really works very well. It turns out that we actually reproduce the statistics of these coefficients. Even though we only train on one simulation, we are able to reproduce the statistics that we get from looking at many simulations. In this case, we have many simulations. We only train on one, but the synthesized maps actually have the right distributions. And that's because we're using, this works well on maps that have the property of, sorry, I'm blanking on the word right now. The property that the statistics are encoded, basically don't change as a function of position in the map. Ergodicity, that's the word. So for ergodic signals, this just training on a single image that's large enough actually has enough information to generate the right statistics for many images. And we can do this in a coupled way for multiple images now. So here's an example where you start with an n-body simulation and you have a gas simulation. This is the gas density corresponding to this. So there's a hydro simulation. And then we can actually generate other realizations. There's always some stochasticity in these hydro simulations due to the subgrid models and the energy injection. And so we could generate actually multiple realizations of possible gas from a given n-body, or from now we can give me any other n-body and can generate the corresponding gas density distributions. Now, here's just a sort of first exploration of these techniques in the context of CMB data. This is for a patch. This is in the context of B-mode reconstruction. So primordial B-modes being having sometimes been called the holy grail of CMB analysis. So these come from tensor modes. In this particular case, the B modes are generated actually through lensing. This is a case where B modes are generated by lensing. If you actually cover them with a realistic foreground model using from polarized dust emission, the signal basically disappears completely. You still see a little bit of it here in very low foreground regions. Mostly it's just gone. And as opposed to what's typically done, we actually just use a single frequency. We don't use the dust frequency properties for what I'm going to show in a minute, or just now, because we wanted to show whether we could do the foreground signal separation just purely based on the morphological structure of the foreground, which is very different from the signal. And it turns out, yes, you can. So here is the reconstructed B mode per pixel. And you see that in highly foreground dominated regions, you get less reconstruction, but in foreground, and then here we show the uncertainty in these reconstructions. So the higher uncertainty in the dark regions, okay, and in these regions here, we actually have faithful reconstructions. So this uses the wavelet phase harmonics to generate the foreground model, and then trains neural networks, these moment networks that I mentioned earlier, to solve the problem of the posterior mean in every single pixel here. So these are 100,000 pixels or so. So it's a very high dimensional inference problem with very complicated data, but reduced to really a simple analysis problem using these techniques that I've told you about. And we can validate it and it works. Okay, so much time do I have left? I guess we're almost at the end now. We started a bit late, but I can...
Yes. 5 minutes, yeah.
5 minutes? Okay. So I can either tell you about how to compare models with these techniques, because this solves a problem in Bayesian inference called evidence ratio computation, which is kind of, in many contexts, is the hardest part of doing Bayesian inference from a technical perspective. Or I can show you some results on how to unlock complicated data using these techniques. So why don't I'll just give you a very brief view of this recent work here on doing model comparison using these implicit techniques where you only need simulations, nothing else. So I told you about the prior, I told you about the likelihood, I've told you how to get posteriors, but the fourth term in Bayes' theorem, the evidence, is what you need to compare different models. So this is for one model, but if for multiple models, I actually have one equation for every model. And so if I don't know which model the data came from, I need to compute these evidences here. So then once you have these evidences, you can compute their ratio for two models, I and j. That's called the Bayes factor. And you can use that to update your knowledge, your belief, your relative probabilities of the models given the particular data set that you have. And doing that computation is typically very hard, even if you know the likelihood and posterior. But actually now we're talking about situations where it's very hard to write down the likelihood and posterior for non-Gaussian data sets. So the technique here actually allows you to compute the evidence quickly in all cases where you can generate simulations. So even if the likelihood and posterior are explicitly given, just use the likelihood to generate simulations and train an evidence network to compute this very quickly. But even if you don't have an explicitly given one, just use the simulations. And the reason why it's hard to do this in the classical way is because you have to do this integral for every model. You have to integrate over the posterior and the prior, and over the likelihood times the prior, and that's typically very complicated because this can be very complicated functions in high numbers of dimensions. These integrals are very hard to do. So here's an example of where we have a 100-dimensional parameter problem, and we get very, very precise. And this is the case that we can solve analytically, so we have a reference, and we get very precise evidence calculations for this problem. This compares to polychord. This is the best nested sampling technique in the literature that we know of to compute evidences. And here we're comparing the time in terms of number of likelihood evaluations needed for polychord and then compared to the and this is the training time for the evidence network. So this is not the evaluation time. This is the time to train. Evaluation time would be much, much faster, actually. So, but then once you've trained it, you can actually apply it to many data sets and get instantaneous answers for the evidences. And the accuracy is actually also better in these for the test cases that we've run. This works for complicated multimodal situations. Okay, so, but in the last 2 minutes, I want to mention something really cool that I'm excited about and that we're applying to actually understand theoretically better what exactly is constrained by CMB data, what model combinations, what parameter combinations are constrained. But the idea is to train to have this way of basically doing nonlinear PCA. That's really the best way to think about it. We have basically found a way to do very, very analogous to nonlinear PCA, where we can compare parameter, like we can take data and then find parameters that really model these data really well and in a very economical way. So here's an example where we have a synthetic data set, this kind of thick S-shaped data, okay, that we're trying to we do PCA, and you just reduce the dimensionality to just one component, you have no information, and it's just the mean. But for one component, it just finds that, oh, the S is longer in this direction, so it just approximates it with a line. With 2 components, you do get the S, but then in 3 components, you realize that the S has this thickness. With our technique, we call this the information ordered bottleneck, we find that a parameterization that even with one parameter, you already follow the shape of the S, and then with the second parameter, we basically restore the full data. So it really understands the nonlinear nature of data sets. So we try this in many different cases. Here's an example of if you have if you have a data set that you don't really understand. Let's say this is a synthetic data set with the data consists of an image of 2 disks of 2 different sizes. If you do principal component analysis, basically you need many components like to get any kind of reconstruction. But with this, you can just ask yourself, how many degrees of freedom are there in this data set? There are 2 positions, so that's 2 numbers each, that's 4. And then the 2 different sizes for the disks, so that's another 2, so that's 6 parameters. And you can see this technique, the reconstruction basically gets perfect after you give it 6 numbers. So and you can see that these are, even with fewer numbers, you already start getting much better reconstructions of the data. So it's a way to discover the dimensionality of a data set when you really don't have a good model, or to find out and it doesn't just give you some parameters, it gives the first parameter will capture most of the information, the second one will capture the second most, and so forth. So it gives you this information ordered set of parameters for your data. So it's state of the art for discovering the internal dimensionality, intrinsic dimensionality of data sets, running this on many examples. And okay, so I'm going to well, let's skip this, but here's a cool application, and then I'll end. So explain to you what we're going to do. So we're going to take, so here you see this MS COCO data set. That's an image data set that you can use to train an image generator, just like DAL-E. In fact, we'll use DAL-E here. And you have a text, so this is and the thing that makes it work is that you're taking images and you're embedding them together with their descriptions, the text descriptions. So you have an embedding that works on text and on images. But we looked at the image embedding, and basically it turns images into a semantic space. So basically you have an image of a cow and an image of another cow. Those 2 cow images will be very close together, and in fact they will be close to the text embedding for cow. Okay, this is how these image generators work. And so we decided to see, well, what is the intrinsic dimensionality? If you take a large corpus of images, natural images, what's the intrinsic dimensionality of images, natural images? And we find, for example, that it's somewhere around 300 dimensions. And There we don't have a ground truth, but we can compare it to what PCA would give. And PCA clearly, so principal component analysis, really does a bad job. So and the thing is that, okay, so here is an image. I can't stop the animation, but I'll run it again. Here's an image. It's a clock. It's a tower with a funny kind of clock on it with some lights, okay? And what we do is actually we do PCA, so focus on this first. So we do the PCA decomposition of the embedding, and then we generate images from giving it more and more components, okay? So after some time, eventually it gets, oh, this is a clock tower, but the shape is completely wrong. And eventually, with many, many, many components, it realizes, oh, this is not just a clock. In fact, there's some kind of colorful image in the clock. It's blue and green and so forth, okay? All right, so but if we take the components that are extracted with our nonlinear technique, okay, immediately it gets, oh, this is a clock. And while this still thinks it's some kind of a street lamp or something. And then very quickly, it basically immediately gets it's a clock tower, and then very quickly gets that it has some colors, red and, in fact, there was one that looked really very close to this output. So this is interesting because really this technique seems to be extremely good at capturing what we would also consider semantically meaningful combinations. So somehow we found that, first of all, it's unique, always finds internal representations regardless of how you train. And secondly, they're interpretable. And so we're using, that's just something we find phenomenologically, by ordering the information, the most informative one often corresponds to something that we would also articulate as human beings. So we're now applying this to several different data sets, galaxy data sets. We're looking at what are the natural coordinates to parameterize cosmological hydrosimulations, or galaxies coming out of that. Some projects that we're aware of, but people use this. This is all available, so you can, you check this out here. 2305. This is a version of the paper. We have a more recent version. Happy to share that with you if you'd like to get it. And one of the applications is that we try to look at, what parameter combinations does the CMB really constrain? So is it really just omega baryon H squared, or what is the combination that the CMB data really is best at constraining, and how do you order those as a function? Can we define parameter combinations that are kind of mutually informative and petition the information in the CMB in sort of an optimal way? Okay, so we finished on this point. I showed you ways in which machine learning can allow us to recast physics questions as optimization problems, and what we're using this for is to, first of all, to do parameter inference for problems that we couldn't really do at all, just only a few years ago. But we need a combination of physics and astronomy and AI to make progress. And so I've shown you some examples of sophisticated inference problems that can now be solved with this, and also some ways to use these techniques to gain insight into data sets or theories that are defined in a numerical way, or where models aren't yet fully formed. Okay, so let me close on these points, and please feel free to ask questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Ben, for a very illuminating and exciting talk. So it's time for question. So feel free to raise your hand and ask question. Nitin?
Yeah. Hi, Benjamin. Thank you for a nice talk. It was a very nice presentation. My question is, you in the beginning you said that there is this Planck data and polarization, Planck T data and polarization data. So
Yes.
basically, what is that Planck T data and polarization data, and how it is generated?
Okay, sure. So the Planck mission was a CMB mission that flew in 2009 and collected data until a few years later. And it's the best high resolution map that we currently have of the microwave background sky. The microwave background sky is important because it gives us this way of looking back to the past. The photons in the cosmic microwave background sky that we see, that light, those microwave photons, were generated in the primordial plasma. And so we have a way of looking back to the beginning of the universe and looking at the structure. So in fact, I showed you an image of let me go back to that real quick. Near the beginning of my talk. Right at the beginning. So this is actually, this is an image of the temperature data. And the polarization data is a bit harder to visualize, but it's basically these maps on the sky of the temperature in the cosmic microwave background, very highly enhanced. If you looked at this just with your if your eyes were microwave sensitive, you'd just see a uniform glow all over the sky. But Planck was able to really enhance the contrast massively and find the structure. And this is the primordial structure that we can then interpret in terms of these initial conditions that I showed you here. Okay, so to be able to learn about the initial conditions of the universe, which inform all these other studies that I mentioned to you.
Yeah, thank you, Benjamin.
Okay, Suresh.
So you mentioned about
Let me actually try to.
can you hear?
I can
Yes.
hear you, but I would like to see you as
So
well.
you mentioned about usage of wavelets.
Yes.
So there are many wavelets are there. How do you select the proper wavelets? What the
Right.
criteria you adopted?
In fact, that's not really that key. So we're using a smooth wavelet in this particular case. But it turns out these techniques work quite well for really different wavelet families. And typically the wavelet families that we're using are smooth. And so it's true that these methods aren't fantastic if your data set really consists of just individual pixels that are completely on and everything else is empty. So very sparse data sets like that, this probably wouldn't be doing so great because we're applying this to data sets that have I'm trying to switch
My
to
question is specifically related to CMB. CMB
yes.
analysis, if you want to use wavelet, what wavelet you can use it?
Yeah,
CMB
so there we have the wavelet. You can look it up. I don't recall exactly which wavelets we use, but you can look it up in that publication. Am I still sharing the screen? Hold on, I'm slightly I'm just trying to somehow I can't get my Zoom window back.
Okay, thank you.
Just give me a second. Stop. Okay, here we go. I found it. Good. All right.
Yeah, there is one question in the chat box. So I just read the question. Other than CMB data, can we use galaxy spectroscopic survey dataset to infer the primordial density distribution? And in that case, which inference method is the best suited?
Right, exactly. So I actually showed you the example with the dark matter. So that is one step in that direction. And we're actually now trying this out on simulations to look at halos coming out of hydro simulations and see what we can reconstruct from halo catalogs. And then the next step would be to push this forward to the galaxy catalogs. Yeah, and in fact, so this is these methods using conditional diffusion models that I showed you. These are the most recent methods. But this other technique that I mentioned, this Borg technique, let me see if I can just show you that slide. This Borg technique actually has already been applied for initial condition reconstructions from spectroscopic surveys. And in fact, can be used to then run n-body simulations using those initial conditions to produce constrained realizations of our current universe. Hold on let me see if I can share that slide so that you know the reference. There we go. So this is Yash and Wandelt 2013, many papers afterwards. But if you look for this one and you look for papers citing this, then you'll find it.
Okay.
Sorry, thanks for drawing on my slide. Okay, anybody else?
Yeah, there is one question from RI. Yeah, your voice is a bit low.
Hello. Hi, Ben. Parvesh. Actually, I was trying to understand how one can introduce information about physics in the likelihood functions, in the loss function, actually. What are the various can include information about physics in the loss function?
What do you mean with information about physics? I mean, so obviously the simulations that you run already include a physical model. So the physics is included there.
Okay. So other than that, is it possible to introduce some information if you know about some other information about the physics, which you think is not in the simulation? Is there a way to do that?
So one of the key problems that we are now looking at is, given that we're now very excited because we can fit these very complicated models to data, but data are, even these very sophisticated models aren't perfect, and so there are always going to be effects that we haven't completely modeled. And maybe your question is going in that direction. And so when there are physical effects that are not included in our simulations, then there are a couple of different ways we can handle that. We can either add them to the simulations if we know what they are, or we can try to find projections that project the data in such a way that the discrepancy of the data and the simulations are removed, and we can project the simulations in the same way and then compare in the projected space. So we can choose summaries of the data and summaries of the simulations and then compare in that summary space to make these analyses more robust. But then maybe your question is also asking, well, how can I then learn about physics that are in the data, that the data probe, but my simulations don't? And that's a very fascinating topic that I'm spending a lot of time thinking about. The difficulty there is, how do you parameter? So if you find a way to parameterize these additional physical effects, maybe in terms of some terms that are modeled by neural networks, or maybe by terms that are really adding terms to your physical equations. So there are different ways to do that. Once you've parameterized your lack of knowledge, you can then include these additional effects in your forward model and then use, for example, these evidence calculations that I mentioned to ask how much evidence is there in the data for this physical effect or for this physical effect or for those combinations. And having the ability to do these evidence ratio computations, this model comparison in a quantitative way, in cases where all I have are simulations, is really opening up a really new direction for discovering new physics from data. So maybe this is what your question was aiming at.
Thanks.
Yeah, Prashanda.
Hi Ben, nice talk.
Thank you.
I am audible, right? Yeah. Okay. So I had a couple of questions. One was about the moment network, where if you can, I mean, or anyway. So I am a little lost. Can you bring in the slides so then it will be easier to ask?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Let's try to find it. Moment network. Let's see.
In the beginning somewhere you
So here, right?
Yeah. So here you were saying that F is something that you do get from the machine learning. So basically the set of weights. But then how P is known, the probability distribution is known.
That's great. So it's exactly, so on the previous slide I showed you how, so I kind of made the step where if you have a pairs of parameters and parameters here and data, so the data could be simulated and the parameters for simulated data, the true parameters. You then try to find an F that guesses back those true parameters from your simulations.
Right.
And then pairs of X and Y will be samples of this joint distribution.
Okay.
Okay, so that you represent distribution in terms of these samples. And so you can think of this standard kind of least squared loss as a Monte Carlo approximation to this integral loss. Okay, and then once you have this integral loss, you can then show that that minimizing it as with respect to f, the minimizer gives you the posterior mean, and in here it also tells you the minimizer for g gives you posterior variance.
Yeah. So if I understand correctly, then basically doing that sampling is doing the job of the Bayesian sampling that you are talking about.
Exactly. So, but the cool thing is that sampling is unconstrained, so I can just draw from my parameters. I can draw data. Yeah.
It is only done during the training, and afterwards it is not required anymore.
Exactly. So during that training, the network learns essentially implicitly, hence implicit inference, implicitly learns from those simulations the structure, the relevant structure of the Stern distribution.
Yeah. The other question was from the PCA when you compared the method with the PCA,
yes,
which is probably near to the end. So the training data sets basically is telling you what should be the dimensionality of the system, right?
No, you don't know the intrinsic dimension, right? So for the example I showed you here, so here the data set, hold on a second, where would I, like for this synthetic example, for example, with the two disks, here's the true data. The data set here, the dimensionality of the data set is, forget what I think it's maybe 32 cubed or 32 squared or 16 squared, maybe 256. But the true intrinsic dimension, right, is only 6 because you have two disks and two positions and two sizes. And so there isn't a general technique, right, to take you from that number, let's say 256 to 6. And what we find is that these information order bottlenecks, are really quite simple as a simple machine learning setup that is able to extract these meaningful intrinsic. Because I mean, the other thing I didn't have time to say, but if you look at let's say you give it 2 parameters, okay, only 2. What does it get? Well, if you compare to the, for this on these data examples, the 2 parameters give you the position of the bigger disk. Okay, so in these 2 cases, the disks are the same, but in the 2 cases where the disk is bigger, the first parameter that, if you have 2 parameters, it gives you the position of the bigger disk. Then if you have a third parameter, it basically tells you the position and size of the bigger disk. So it really, like, you can look at these parameters, they were found without giving it any kind of semantic input. But somehow the fact that it's ordering the parameters by their information content, that seems to correspond to something that we find easier to interpret.
No, so but then with this information, so will you like to decide like how many hidden layers you will have? Like if there are
with this information, like if you have a data set and you're trying to build a physical model for it, again, an old school kind of physical model, the first thing you have to decide is how many degrees of freedom do I put into my model? And so that's a difficult problem. You don't necessarily know this. You look at a bunch of data, it's complicated. You don't know what if you want to write down some differential equations maybe for the system, but how many parameters do you track? 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 10. And so, the idea is for this to be a tool that tells you how many parameters you might want to track. And then if also to explore the system in terms of, you can then look at these kinds of plots here to show you, okay, the first, here are some systematic, some relationships between the parameters and the data outputs that are interpreted. That seem to be accidentally, with the setup, seem to be fairly interpretable. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
No problem.
You can.
Other questions?
Hi, I have a very naive question. So I just want to ask, in terms of conventional mathematical methods, where do we stand in the terms of machine learning methods? Like, what are the accuracy achieved by the ML models so far, like for CMB?
I see. So I don't think any CMB datasets have yet been analyzed using machine learning. So that's why I said Whither the CMB in my title. So really, this is a forward-looking talk where I'm showing a set of. So I think the history of this is that. So I spend most of my time doing cosmic microwave background during a number of years in preparation for the Planck mission, and we developed these techniques that are. So these Bayesian inference techniques that are now being used and have been used on Planck. I showed you some examples that are now being used on other data sets, delensing methods, for example, that are being used on SPT data and so forth. And then I've become very interested in these nonlinear inference problems, mostly related to, for example, 21 centimeter or galaxy surveys. And so these are really hard problems because those are very nonlinear data sets. And so, but we're trying to import the same kind of approach that we were using for the CMB to these other situations, but the complexity of the data was a lot higher. And that's really led to the development of these techniques that I've described to you. And I think now is the time because the CMB has now also arrived. CMB cosmology has arrived in an era where all the data sets are non-Gaussian or nonlinear because you have secondary effects, because you have noise, because you have foregrounds. And I think we're now at the point, luckily, that we have these techniques so that we can attack the CMB using these very powerful new techniques. And so that's an exciting direction for the future that I look forward to exploring with my collaborators and you.
Sorry, I may have a nice question, so maybe I've missed. So you mentioned this uh, technique where you try to infer the initial conditions from the later universe observation, and you say that there is a uncertainty because the same initial condition can give you multiple different image of the late time universe, right? So that's why there is a uncertainty in the initial condition inferred from the late time universe. So I was just
Right.
wondering, yeah. So I was wondering, like, if it's possible to take into account like different time probes, and for example, different screens and different
Sorry,
redshifts.
I can't hear you very well. Time what?
So I'm saying that if we can take like different probe, like multi-probes analysis of the
Yes.
same initial condition, and if that can break the degeneracy and hence can, decrease the uncertainty.
Okay, so but yeah, in this particular case, the nonlinearity really it's sort of a fundamental problem that you have a whole patch of the initial universe, just of the initial conditions, just collapses more or less to a single point. It's not completely true because there's still structure in a halo. So you have a halo profile, there's a concentration of the halo, and you have subhalos. So there's a little bit of information. So if you really had fantastic data, maybe you could lift a little bit of that degeneracy. But nonlinear processes, if you've ever thought about dynamical systems, nonlinear dynamical systems, whenever there are nonlinear kind of growing modes, they typically lead to the generation of entropy when you look at the result in a coarse-grained way. And we're always going to, we'll never be able to have every single dark matter particle's velocity and position to infinite precision, right? So we'll always be looking at the data in some coarse-grained way. And so then, so what gravity really is doing on these very small scales is there's some information loss about the initial conditions because of these nonlinear processes that are just collapsing. The first order is just collapsing all of that whole region to a single point. That's not, as I said, it's not completely true. You can maybe go deeper, but then there are many other processes that play a role that are not just gravity. So for example, you have black holes forming in the centers of galaxies. They produce very strong outflows. Those outflows of jets and so forth, they react back on the dark matter. They change the dark matter properties. So I think when you want to really dig that deeply, eventually you'll hit a limit where all those nonlinear effects eventually give you some kind of limit in terms of how well you can reconstruct. But just to be clear, current methods stop at a much earlier stage than what I was showing. So current methods just smooth away essentially all structure below 25 megaparsecs or more. So, and here we're talking about structure at the level of a single halo which is of order a megaparsec or two. Right?
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Any more questions? I don't see any raised hand. So let's thank Ben, Cyclab, for on the behalf of all the audience. Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Thanks a lot, Ben.
Take care. I look forward to your. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me.
Thank you, Benjamin.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.